What would you do if, in the middle of an icy forest, you came across 4 lonely, fragile and hungry wolf cubs? Most of us would walk away in fear. Others, perhaps, would just look on from afar. But an elderly woman with a heart marked by loneliness and eyes tired by life did the unthinkable. She welcomed them. Unknowingly, in that act of pure compassion, she changed not only the fate of those little wolves, but also hers. What seemed to be just a gesture of quiet kindness years later would turn into something that even she could not imagine. Do animals have memory? Do they feel gratitude? Is there any invisible link between a pure act and an impossible return? This is the story of how saving 4 wolf cubs became a lesson in love, instinct, and the surprising return of nature. You'll be thrilled, surprised, and maybe even wondered, will everything we do ever come back to us, even when no one is looking? 1. The unexpected encounter. It was a cold morning, with the ground covered in a thin layer of snow and the sky painted grey. Mrs. Edith, known only as the old woman of the cabin, made her usual way to collect firewood. Already elderly, with slow steps and a spine bent by time, she had lived alone on the edge of the forest for more than 20 years since she lost her husband. He had his silent rituals and a deep respect for nature. That day, however, something interrupted his routine. As he crossed a denser stretch of forest, a soft, insistent sound caught his attention. It was a lament, small, sharp, almost choked. Edith approached, intrigued. Behind a pile of twigs and dry leaves, he found 4 wolf cubs huddled together, shivering with cold, their eyes large and frightened. His instincts told him to back off. He knew that a mother wolf could be nearby and that this meeting could end badly. But she also knew in her heart that these puppies had been abandoned. They were too weak to howl, to defend themselves, or even to flee. Edith crouched slowly, reaching out calmly, whispering words that even she didn't fully understand. It was the moment when his life took a new direction. Very carefully, she wrapped the puppies in her woolen blanket, carrying them against her chest, like a grandmother protecting her grandchildren. He knew that his little hut was cold and cramped, but at least they would be alive there. He didn't know what would come next, only that he couldn't leave them there to die. When she returned home, she felt something strange in the air, as if she were being watched. He stopped, looked to the sides, but there was no one. It was just her Dee and the little wolves. That night, sitting in front of the fireplace, watching the little ones sleep huddled in a basket, Edith felt something long forgotten, a purpose. She didn't know it, but she had just planted an invisible seed, something that time would try to nurture, and one day, almost magically, she would discover that that gesture, apparently forgotten by the forest, would not go unnoticed. 2. Courage decision. In the days that followed, Edith faced the weight of her decision. Caring for 4 wolf cubs was no simple task. They cried, trembled, demanded warmth, food, and most of all, patience. She improvised bottles with pieces of cloth soaked in goat's milk, heated blankets in the iron oven, and stayed up long nights tending to each one as if they were part of her own flesh. The village community, upon learning the story, called her crazy. "You'll end up being devoured," they said, but Edith did not listen. He had seen in the eyes of those wolves something deeper than threat. There was fear, pain, and a chance to start over. She knew she couldn't keep them forever. It was too risky. But he also knew that if he returned them too soon to nature, they would die. The forest, though beautiful, was cruel to the weak. For weeks, she fed them with the little she had. He hunted small rabbits, shared his broth with them, and taught them to recognize sounds, movements, and even smells. Edith, without even realizing it, became part of that pack. When the wolves began to grow, their energy changed. They were no longer fragile. They began to explore the yard, to sniff the surrounding woods, and even to growl at the slightest sign of danger. It was then that Edith made the most difficult decision of her life: to free them. He led them one by one to a distant clearing where there was water, natural shelter, and safety. The four, as if understanding, did not resist. They stood there, watching her go, their eyes fixed as if they knew it was goodbye. Edith returned home with a heavy heart, but with a light conscience. He knew he had done what was right. She had chosen the most difficult path, that of love without possession, of surrender without reward. That night, alone once again in front of the fireplace, Edith wept, but not of regret. He cried for having had courage. She cried for having loved without expecting anything in return. And in some dark corner of the forest, four young wolves raised their snouts to the moon, carrying in their wild hearts the living memory of those who once dared to care for them as children. 3. Days of struggle. The months that followed were hard for Edith. After the wolves left, the silence of the hut seemed even heavier. Those days of feeding, warming, and teaching the little animals had filled his time and his heart. Now the routine seemed empty, and loneliness was knocking the door again. But she was no longer the same woman as before. Something had changed profoundly within her. Living with wolves had awakened in her a kind of strength that she did not know she still possessed. And that strength would be tested when a merciless winter struck the forest. The storm started suddenly. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the snow covered everything outside, blocking the way to the village. Edith was isolated. His groceries began to run out. Firewood was scarce, and food even more so. Sometimes she trudged to the storeroom with difficulty, trying to save every splinter of wood and every spoonful of flour. Without electricity or contact with anyone, the elderly woman fought a daily battle against cold, hunger, and fear. Every morning was a challenge, every night a test, and even so she resisted. He thought of the wolves that had survived because of him. This gave him the courage to continue day after day. At one point, the cough came. Fever. The weak body. Edith had no way to seek help. She knew that if she didn't get better on her own, there would be no salvation. She spent 2 whole days lying down, wrapped in blankets, feeding only on hot water and weak broths. His body struggled, but his mind tried not to give up. During one of these nights, while delirious with fever, she dreamed of wolves. In the dream, they were around her, silently, watching her. One of them would approach and lie next to him, as he did when he was a puppy. She woke up startled in a cold sweat. The dream seemed too real. Edith could barely get up, but she kept hope alive. She was determined to win, as she had taught the wolves to survive. And even without knowing it, something was about to change. What she had planted in the past was beginning to flourish in the heart of the forest. In the darkest days of her struggle, when all seemed lost, nature, silent, patient, prepared her return. 4. Silence in the forest. After nearly 2 weeks of isolation, the storm ceased. The white of the snow reflected the light of the faint sun that reappeared between the clouds. Edith was alive, but weakened. He left the house only as much as necessary and with a lot of effort. The cold was still cutting, and the forest seemed quieter than ever. She noticed an eerie silence. It was not the usual silence of frosty mornings, but something deeper, as if the forest was waiting for something. A kind of pause, of expectation. Edith felt it in her bones. One morning, as she went out to fetch water from the well, she noticed marks in the snow. They were footprints, great, recent. He stopped immediately, his heart racing. The first thought was of danger, perhaps a bear or some hungry animal, but when he looked more closely, he recognized the pattern. They were wolf footprints. He followed with his eyes the path left by his paws, which extended to the edge of the forest. There was more than one set of brands, 4 to be exact. His heart raced. It could not be a coincidence. That number was a clear reminder. But why now? Why, after so long, would they return? In the following days, new footprints emerged, always around the house, but never too close. No howl, no growl, only footprints, and on one occasion, game remains left at the entrance to the cabin. Edith almost couldn't believe her eyes. A clean, freshly slaughtered rabbit. She had not hunted. It was a gift. The forest, once silent and cold, was beginning to whisper a message that only she could understand. Something was about to happen, something that nature itself prepared in secret, and in that almost sacred silence, Edith was beginning to feel, for the first time in a long time, that she was no longer alone. 5. Something is watching. The nights were long again, but now with a different kind of presence in the air. Edith felt that something or someone was watching her. It was not fear that he felt, but a strange sense of careful vigilance. It was as if the forest had eyes, as if his every step was accompanied by a lively silence. She kept finding traces. Game left at the door, branches arranged in an unusual way, marks on the trees, as if they had been scratched by claws. And always, 4 pairs of footprints surrounding your home. In one day, a grey feather was left on the threshold. In the other, a small pile of dry leaves, delicately stacked. Edith went to sleep with the window ajar, waiting for a sound, a signal, anything. Sometimes he dreamed of wolves, now adults, strong, imposing, walking through the woods as guardians. Other times I woke up feeling that there was someone outside. An old instinct told him that it was not a hallucination. It was real. One of these nights, when she heard a crack outside the hut, she stood up carefully. He approached the window and looked into the darkness. The moon illuminated the forest with a soft, silvery light. And there they were, 4 immobile shadows in a line a few meters from the house. They were large, elegant, with eyes shining like silent embers. Edith did not move. Neither did wolves. It was as if everyone understood that this moment was sacred. A reunion without words, an old link being reactivated. They stood there for a while, just watching. Then one of them approached. It was the largest, with a dark coat. He took 3 steps and stopped, his head held high. Edith, without thinking, opened the door and stood there, facing him, enveloped by the icy wind and the warmth of that gaze. There was no threat, just recognition. After a few moments, the wolf turned and returned to the forest. The others followed him in silence. But now Edith knew. They were around. They were with her. From that day on, every time he went out, he left some food outside. And always the next day, he found something left in return. Flowers, clean bones, fragrant sprigs. The forest had become his ally, and the wolves his invisible guardians. It was a silent exchange. A pact sealed years ago, and now finally renewed. No promises, no words, just presence. Something was watching her, yes, but not with the intention of hurting, but of protecting. 6. The surprising return. Time passed. The visits continued, always discreet, always mysterious. But it was on a spring afternoon, while tending to the garden next to the cabin, that something truly extraordinary happened. Edith heard a noise, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods. She turned quickly and saw the largest of the wolves, alone this time, standing by the trees. His eyes had no anger but urgency. He looked at her intensely, as if asking her to follow him. Edith felt her heart race. Without thinking, she took her coat, leaned on her cane, and began to walk toward him. The wolf retreated slowly, making sure she followed him, but without straying too far. It was as if he knew the rhythm of his tired steps. After a few minutes, they came to a clearing where a deer had been caught in a trap left by poachers. The animal was still alive, but injured. Edith understood right away. The wolf had come for her to help. She approached slowly, spoke softly to the deer, and with a knife she carried strapped to her waist, carefully freed him. The wolf watched attentively, but without moving. When the deer managed to get up and staggered back into the woods, the wolf looked at Edith and let out a small howl. It was almost a thank you. Then he returned to the forest. That night, Edith cried. She was no longer just the woman who had once saved 4 puppies. Now it was part of the forest cycle. The help he once offered was being returned in ways he had never imagined. The return of the wolves was not just physical, it was symbolic, a reminder that no gesture of kindness is lost. They have not forgotten. On the contrary, they carried with them the memory of care, and now they reciprocated with protection, with help, with respect. Edith understood there that wolves were more than animals. They were free souls who had recognized theirs. And now, with every step they took around their house, with every gift left, with every silent look, they said, "We remember." The return did not come in the form of words, but actions. Not with promises, but with gestures. And this was the purest language that nature could offer. 7. A debt paid. Time passed like a slow, silent breeze. Edith's hair, already white for years, was now thinner. His steps became even shorter and his body more fragile. Life in the forest required effort, and she gave it with dignity. But his days began to darken. Health became a constant challenge, and she knew in silence that the end was approaching. Despite this, she never felt abandoned. The wolves remained nearby. They didn't show up as often anymore, but she knew, always knew, that they were there. On some mornings, I saw recent footprints. At other times, she heard distant howls, as if singing to her. It was a constant, almost spiritual presence. On an especially cold night, Edith felt weaker than ever. The fireplace was still burning slowly, but she didn't have the strength to add any more wood. He lay down in his armchair, covered himself with the old shawl he had worn since his youth, and closed his eyes. He breathed slowly. He heard the wind passing through the trees. He heard the living forest. And then he heard something else. Steps, several, light but determined. They were approaching the door. She opened her eyes with effort, just enough to see the figure of the largest wolf standing at the entrance. He didn't growl. It did not advance. He just looked at her. Behind him, the other 3. In silence, like a solemn guard, Edith felt no fear. He felt peace. It was as if they had come to be with her, to make sure she wasn't alone at that moment. There was no roaring or dramatization. There was presence, fidelity, respect. The wolves lay down on the porch, forming a circle around the door. One of them, the one with a light coat, leaned his snout against the wood of the entrance, as if he heard his breathing on the other side. They stayed there all night, motionless, guarding your friend. The next morning, neighbors who came to visit, Edith found her asleep forever in her armchair. His face was serene, almost smiling, no sign of suffering. And outside, footprints in the fresh snow, large, circular, deep, surrounded the hut like a last watch. The story spread throughout the village, crossing generations. Many doubted, others were moved, but the older ones knew. That woman had done something that few would dare to do. She loved the savage, cared for it without expecting a return, and trusted instinct when everyone doubted. The wolves had quietly, loyally, and grandly paid off the debt. Not with words, but with presence. They were with her when she needed it most. They gave him something that almost no one had. True company until his last breath. The cabin today is still there, covered in moss and time. It is said that from time to time, 4 wolves are seen in the vicinity, walking slowly around the house as if they were waiting for someone to return. But maybe it's not waiting. Maybe it's just nostalgia. Because sometimes the deepest debts are not paid with gold, but with love and memory.